911 operators, what are the dumbest things someone called you for? Guy called for a suspicious PKG on his porch. Cop comes out, picks it up, looks at it, then asks if he ordered anything from Amazon. Guy says yes. Cop hands him the PKG and says, "Have a good day." Guy just says sorry and goes in the house. Story 2. Every year, our local police put out a list of dumb calls. Every year, people call 911 because their garbage wasn't picked up or their internet/TV aren't working. Story 3. My dad accidentally threw away the little card phones used to have where you'd write down what the quick dial buttons were for. So he decided to fill in a new one. Only issue is he didn't know what they were anymore. So he called them, one after the other. When he found the button for police, he got the 911 operator. Thinking quickly, he just hung up. They traced the call and sent the fire department, an ambulance, and 2 cop cars. My dad had to explain what he'd done. They laughed, told him to be more careful next time. No harm, no foul. Then he continued his efforts and found the button that connected to the fire department. Everyone was sent back and they were a little less amused. Story 4. I don't work for 911, but I read this in the news. David Blackman called deputies on Sunday to report that someone had stolen a bag of substances and some cash from his car. Got to love Florida Man and his escapades. Story 5. Not a 911 operator, but I work in the ER, and the number of young men, typically, who come in after their first major hangover always has me laughing. To those who are angry or upset about this, please know we can see the difference between alcohol poisoning and a bad hangover. Story 6. Had an elderly lady in SC Low Country call, and she was afraid someone had put a root on her, kind of like voodoo. Some white powder like flour had appeared on her porch and she didn't know what to do. I asked her if she had a straw broom. She did. I told her to get the broom and a dustpan, walk backward out the door into the mysterious powder, sweep it into the dustpan, and back up to the left side of her porch. Throw the powder out over her left shoulder, dust the broom off well on the porch rail, and that was that. She did it and was happy. Story 7. I can't get this jar of peanut butter open, and if I don't get the peanut butter in the feeder, the squirrels will be mad maniacal laughter. Frequent flyer, mentally ill. There's a huge fire. Oh, get the fire department here now. It was the full moon shining through trees. I let my parakeet out to get some air, and now he's stuck in a tree. Award-winning event at the annual firefighter dinner for most entertaining call for service. Included gems such as Unit 1400 on scene, no feathers showing from the outside, checking the area, and dispatch be advised, subject is a flight risk. Story 8. NZ has 111 operators that connect you to emergency services. I used to be a 111 operator, and before are some of the dumbest things I've had. The moon is too big. Government spiders are in my ears again. The neighbor has recorded me coughing and has been playing it back to me for 24 hours on high. The people in my living room are watching Coronation Street and I don't like it. Plot twist, she was the only one home and had left the TV on. I can't turn my shower off. Nuts. More times than I can count. Everyone is driving at me and I don't like it. Plot twist, he was driving the motorhome on the wrong side of the road. Story 9. We had a squad that called in for non-transport because the caller had pooped and couldn't wipe. So they called 911 to have them wipe their butt. Blink. Story 10. My company has an emergency number for chemical, medical, facility emergencies that forwards to my personal phone and rings an alarm that's probably guaranteed to raise me from the dead. A manager realized this was a direct line to my personal phone that I would not ignore under any circumstances, and started calling the emergency number to reach me when I was off from work with issues like, an app on my PC can't find the network, help me right now. I am not the company's it supports. Our director was extremely displeased with their poor judgment. Story 11. Not a 911 operator, but a bomb squad once stormed a restaurant I worked at. An older gentleman came in asking to use our phone because he needed to call the police. I recognized him from the neighborhood, so I let him. I was standing next to the wait station when I heard him say, "I just put a bomb under the dumpster behind the 7-Eleven. Yes, I'll wait here." He then hangs up. I told him we weren't comfortable with him waiting in the restaurant and could he please sit on the benches outside. We were kind of freaked out. He walks outside and sits on the benches in the square and calmly waits. I go back on the floor and there's a big commotion in the kitchen. 2 guys in tactical gear and a guy in some sort of armor are forcing their way in from the alley. Customers start freaking out and the cooks start yelling that the old guy is outside. It turns out the old guy was in the lobby of the German restaurant and saw a box that said bomb on it, assumed it was a bomb, and put it in the safest place he could think of, under the dumpster behind the 7-Eleven. It was a bomb torte. Story 12. I once got a call from 911. Do you have a child with an emergency? The dispatcher was being professional, but I could tell she was trying not to laugh. I say one moment as I walk upstairs to interrogate my then 5-year-old. He loved trucks. I'd given him a video with emergency vehicles. Fire trucks, ambulances, police cars. I guess they thought this was a good place to advertise, "Hey kids, call 911 if you have an emergency." Such a convincing message, he called. I asked why. His answer, "My neck hurts." Story 13. Not a 911 operator, but I was a campus police officer at an expensive private university. I got dispatched to a call of a man unloading boxes from his car in a parking garage. I was extremely confused and called our dispatch center on my personal phone to try to get more details. Turns out, someone had seen a black man unloading boxes from his car and baselessly suggested that the car was stolen. I just drove around the parking garage for a minute and cleared the call. Story 14. I don't work for 911, but I used to work at a restaurant, and we had a guy one time who called 911 because we refused to serve him alcohol. One, he looked like he was 16 years old and didn't have an ID. Two, he was already so drunk he couldn't actually manage to sit on a bar stool and not fall off. And we were fairly sure he drove there. One of our managers was actually on the phone calling the non-emergency police line to see if somebody could come pick him up and dump him in the drunk tank when this guy decides to call 911 that we won't serve him liquor. Story 15. My wife used to be 911 operator in a small town of 20K with an interstate running through it. Man called reporting a drunk on the golf course. Said something about being black and white. My wife asks if the drunk is black or white. The man says, "Both." Turns out it was a skunk, and the caller was the drunk lady with mental health issues calling about the government tracking her and asking the operators to tell the authorities to stop, usually about once a week. Truck driver causing an accident, shutting down the interstate because he was trying to pleasure while driving 70 miles an hour. You need to send a police officer to stop these Spanish people from playing their music so loud. It sounds like a taco commercial. A cow got loose and was walking on the highway. A man called asking if a certain officer was on duty and if he could come by his house and help with his BBQ. The officer made it at a party one time and gave him the recipe, but it wasn't turning out right. Story 16. Paramedic here. Once we had a young woman call 911 around 2 a.m. saying that her legs were turning blue. Turns out she had worn a new pair of jeans to the club that night. Story 17. Remember the anthrax panic shortly after 9/11? People were calling in suspicious white substances all the time. The vast majority were dumb, but the dumbest that I know of was someone who called in a suspicious white substance that was slowly forming in their freezer. Suspicious packages from China that they didn't order but mysteriously showed up. It has to be explained to them that Wish or AliExpress orders often comes directly from China. Concerned that wild turkeys in her backyard were going to freeze to death during the winter and wanted animal control to take them indoors for the winter. Complaining that their rural neighbors' dogs howl loudly at night, then being in disbelief or scared when they're informed by deputies who check the area that it's just the sounds of coyotes. One frequent caller was in such disbelief that it was coyotes that he started complaining to the county commissioners that the deputies were refusing to give citations to his neighbor, who didn't even have any pet dogs at that point. New rural resident that wanted his road shut down to commercial truck traffic because it is a residential zone and they're noisy. He refused to be reasonable when informed that it was a state highway and that it wasn't legal nor reasonable for the county to restrict semi-trucks from it. Likewise, people new to rural living who buy a house along a 65 mph highway and then complain that people drive by their house without slowing down. As you can tell, a lot of the dumb calls in my area are from idiots. Story 18. My mom's town will post police 911 activity in the newspaper. It's so often not criminal activity. And when it is, it's usually teenagers checking car doors but not actually stealing anything. More often than anything else, it's bored, quietly, retirees calling whenever they see a brown person. Example, complained of strange woman entering neighbor's home. No forced entry. Officers greeted by neighbor's new housekeeper. And story 19. My dad told me about multiple ridiculous 911 calls during his time as a paramedic. One of the most ridiculous was a woman called for being out of milk and that she needed them to get some for her. Happened twice with the same woman. She didn't have dementia as they initially suspected. Turns out she was just super entitled. Story 20. DV has been the hot topic where I'm at for a while now. We had a legislation come in that requires police to attend every call that alluded to or mentioned DV. I dispatched a crew to a DV-coded job once because the caller alleged that her ex-husband had shrunk himself down to the size of a coin and slipped under her door and was messing with her electronics, changing the TV channels and turning the kettle off when she went to boil it, things like that. He was also invisible, so it was really hard to catch him in the act. A woman called one day to report DV because her soon-to-be ex-husband had used exclamation marks in his emails to her, and she felt threatened. Non-DV related, a man called one day very upset because a large turtle was on the beach, and he thought it would die because they can only breathe underwater. He was very distressed and angry that I wouldn't send a crew to get it back in the water. tried to explain that turtles lay eggs in the sand and it was in no danger of dying. An elderly woman's bird had gotten out of its cage and had become tangled in the cords for the window blinds. She was so incredibly distressed. We sent a crew to check on her and rescue the bird. Absolute dumbest, though, is all the tourists we have to rescue from hikes and inhospitable terrain because they go out ill-prepared, go off track, get hurt, don't know where they are, didn't bring enough water, extra. Story 21. I'm a former sheriff's deputy of a rural county in the southwest U.S. One night, our dispatch got a 911 call with a woman who, in the dispatcher's words, was shrieking incoherently. She then screamed, "No, no," and the line went dead. Dispatch attempted to call back, but they got no answer. We had cops from 3 agencies, fire trucks and ambulances from 2 fire departments respond, and a state police helicopter en route. Turns out a bat had gotten into the house and was zooming around trying to find a way out. The woman had a phobia of mice, which the bat triggered. The bat had buzzed her head, which was when she screamed, "No, no, no," and in her panic, she had pulled the phone cord from the wall. Pre-cell phone days. She was embarrassed and afraid she was going to get in trouble because so many of us had showed up, but we were all just happy that was all it was, and reassured her everything was fine. The dispatcher who took the call broke down in tears when she found out the woman was okay. She had spent several minutes thinking she had listened to a murder in real time. Story 22. I have had hundreds of parking complaints come in via 911. My personal favorite, however, and I had someone call 911 to complain about a city ordinance that their neighbor hadn't mowed their lawn. I had them call the non-emergency number to report it, which went to the person sitting next to me. I made them look up the number and call to be spiteful. They didn't know the non-emergency number, and 911 went to 2 people in the same room. The house in question with the unmoved lawn belonged to an on-duty police officer for that town. So we sent him to take the ordinance violation complaint from his neighbor on himself. Story 23. My aunt was at 911 for 30+ years in Florida. Lots of stories. One night, a lady called from the McDonald's drive-thru because they were out of chicken nuggets. Story 24. Back when I was in high school, a group of boys were making prank calls to emergency services. The lunch lady who had tolerated a bunch of crap from them had enough and called the non-emergency line to report them. Police arrived, fined them, and the boys got detention for a month. I later learned that their parents were not amused and grounded them for the same month, and took all electronics so they couldn't communicate with each other outside of school. And the boys had to pay the fines with their own money. Their parents wouldn't pay a single dime. At school, every other student was disgusted by their behavior and ignored them completely. The rest of the year, the boys were incredibly well behaved. Story 25. Many, many years ago, 1962 or so, I managed to rotary dial the Ohio State Highway Patrol and tell them to come arrest my mom because she wouldn't let me go outside and play in the rain. I was 4. Story 26. One time, a few years ago, my daughter and I wondered if the peppermint essential oil roller that we use for migraines would make a good deodorant. It was a little vial of oil that you would dab on your forehead for headaches. But we learned the hard way it was not for application on armpits. It created an icy hot sensation that was painful. We laughed our asses off while fanning our pits. Anyway, fast forward. I'm working 911 and a scared young lady called saying she was afraid she was having an allergic reaction. I asked her to explain. She said she put a bunch of peppermint essential oil in her bath, and when she got out, the oil coated her body and she was in excruciating full body pain, like freezing and burning at the same time. I felt so bad for her. I couldn't tell her she was going to be fine, even though I highly suspected she was. Meanwhile, she kept asking, Am I going to pass? Poor thing. It wasn't dumb that she called. Always call if you're not sure. It was just a dumb accident that I could totally relate to. Story 27, not a dispatcher. On the other side of the field, we got a call for a hot prowl in progress. Girl was barricaded in her bathroom and stating that someone was trying to get in her apartment. Gave us a description of the guy, so she must have seen him at some point. We get there, detain the dude, and it turns out it's her boyfriend that was trying to unlock the door with a bad copy of the key she gave him. She even confirmed that he was set to arrive at that time and didn't put it all together. This girl called police on her own boyfriend that was at the right time, at the right place, and had given her notifications that he was there. In speaking to her, I can see why. Dumb as ducking bricks. Story 28. How to choose when they happen daily. Most recently, there was the guy who had his cab driver go through a McDonald's drive-thru on his way home from a night out. When he got home, he realized his order was wrong, so he took another cab all the way back to that same McDonald's in another city to have them correct it. Then called 911 over the staff there refusing to pay his cab fare. I looked up the distance from his house to any other more convenient McDonald's location, and there was one a 5-minute walk from his house. There was the guy who got kicked out of a hockey game by the police for intoxication, so he called the police on the police for kicking him out. Also, I'd like to report that I just threw my takeout bag in the dumpster, but my umbrella was in it, that's all. Accidentally threw out his umbrella and wanted the police to come and fish it out of a dumpster for him. There was no dispatch for any of these calls. Story 29. I was the cause of one of these as a child. I must have been 5 or 6 years old, and my father believes in learning through doing. I knew to call 911 in an emergency, but he wanted me to have the experience of actually doing it. After a few minutes of hesitation and resisting, I did ask, was told. I still remember the person on the other end. The conversation was something along the lines of, "What is your emergency?" "I don't have an emergency." "Why are you calling?" "Because my dad told me to." "Is your dad okay?" "Yes." "What is your emergency?" "I don't have an emergency." "And is your dad there?" "Yes." "Can you hand him the phone, please?" Presumably the operator ripping him a new one, and him trying to explain why he thought this was a God idea, followed by him confirming he understood not to do it again. He did not do this with my younger sibling. Story 30. I'm not a 911 operator, but I used to work in the after-hours office for a foster care organization and would get emergency calls from the foster homes we licensed. Some notable ones. Younger sister pooped in older sister's shoes. They were leaving for school, took this call in the 6 a.m. hour. 8-year-old wouldn't eat dinner, placed in a cross-cultural household, all new foods. 6-year-old wouldn't go to bed on his first night in the home. I did a quick skim of his paperwork and immediately figured out he was scared of the dark. Call from a kid because her foster mom wouldn't let her 19-year-old boyfriend spend the night at their house. She was 15. I did not get paid nearly enough for that job. Story 31. Not necessarily intentionally dumb, but ended up being dumb. I was doing at work at a 911 dispatch center. Call came in from a homeowner who arrived home, parked in her garage, and heard movement in the master bedroom on the 2nd floor. No one was supposed to be in the house, so she called 911 to report an intruder. All the cops in the town headed to the residence. Nearby PDS were asked to set up a perimeter to keep the intruder from escaping. Officers entered the home and did a room-by-room search, weapons drawn. What they found was a Roomba vacuum that had gotten itself stuck in the bedroom closet. It was banging against the walls trying to escape to complete its duties. Story 32. Not a 911 dispatcher, but I did have a crazy neighbor who literally called 911 for so many stupid reasons. They flagged her as a nuisance, called about a feral animal attacking people. It was a deer, and it was asleep on the grass across from our houses. Called about someone creeping around in our yard, hiding behind the hedge, waiting to attack her. Sitting on my front steps having a cigarette. Called about street racing vehicles. Nope, just cars she didn't recognize, driving down our street. The horror! She actually got a ticket for this one, though, because she started standing in the middle of the road, stopping traffic to yell at people and shove a camcorder in their face and hit their vehicles if they tried to go around her. She was a real hoot to live next door to. Story 33. When my sister was 6 years old, she dialed 911 after her school class went on a tour of a dispatch center. There was nothing wrong. She just wanted to know if it worked. Facepalm. 2 police officers showed up to our door. We had no idea she had called. They chatted with me for a bit at the front door. When she came downstairs from her room, she made a happy shriek and jumped for joy that they had come. The 2 officers, one black male and one Hispanic female, responding to a call in a majority white suburban neighborhood, told her to describe the situation to the dispatch officer next time. They gave her a sticker, patted her on the head, and sent her back inside. After my sister was well out of earshot, both officers, hand to chest, said it was the most nerve-wracking call they had gotten that day, but were glad it turned out fine. The story lives on in our family. Always give the 911 dispatcher details. Story 34. Here goes. I live in an area with a lot of waterways. In one particular area, there's a very large rock in a shallow that's close to a road, like 40 yards or so. Well, someone always puts a fake dog out there. This generated a bunch of calls about a trapped animal. Mind you, sensible people know dogs are very good swimmers. The rock is not far from any land, and you would come to the also sensible conclusion that said animal can clearly just swim back. These callers were never local, as locals were very aware that this was a very fake animal. Needless to say, we'd have to send an officer to swing by anyway. But it generated lots of laughs for a while, and then there was the fake submarine sail, the stack you see sticking up, in a wastewater basin visible from the road. Yep, phone calls. People really call about everything. Story 35. I think it was the call I made. This was a long time ago, before they could trace calls. I was outside at night and looked up and noticed 5 Globus aerostatics, which are big lighted paper balloons from South America, that I recognized from seeing while living there as a child. But I lived in the Midwest and thought it important to let emergency services know. I called 911 and said, "If anyone reports the lights in the sky, tell them not to worry." "Well," the dispatcher said in a dead cold voice, "where are you?" Realizing how that conversation sounded, I hung up immediately. Story 36. Not me personally, but one of my trainees got a caller asking where to get the best bacon donuts because she had a work party that morning and forgot to get them in advance. When the trainee said she had no idea, the caller retorted along the lines of, "You should know, what about the stereotype?" This caller was completely serious. I can't think what my personal dumbest one was. I do remember once I had a Spanish-speaking caller dial 911 because there was a beehive in a tree in the empty lot next door to him. As I don't speak Spanish, I had to connect to an interpreter service, which doubled the call time. This was, of course, a day or two after Hurricane Ian hit our county, and a good portion of it was underwater. He was really concerned that the neighborhood kids might get stung by the bees. Story 37. How about from just this week? 1. About 10 inches of snow fell. Lady calls and says she pulled into a random person's driveway and they won't let her stay there. 2. Woman calls for police because she's stuck in snow, refuses to get a tow because Highway Depth isn't doing a good enough job, and wants the officer to drive her home. 3. Guy calls and says someone is breaking into his house. Sounds like a man's voice. When asked if he could make out words, he goes, "It sounded like meow." Police get there. No burglary. It was his ducking cat. 4. They saw an owl and was concerned it might be cold. 5. Guy wants to speak to police because he's thinking about his girlfriend. She's not there. He's not suicidal. They didn't get into a fight. No domestic issues. He's just worried about his future with her. Story 38. Used to answer policy emergency calls in the UK and had the following. When do the clocks go back? My son has been forced to eat 3 pears. My neighbors are having sex with the curtains open and I can see everything. There's a young man stabbing a tree. Somebody has put suspicious packages in the dog poo bin. Packages described as small, wrapped in black plastic bags, possibly dog poo. A child at nursery stole my daughter's beaded bracelet and we wanted to press charges. The kettle is broken. Story 39. Huge storm knocked power out for a large area. Man called screaming and cussing me out because I wouldn't flip the switch to turn the power back on. He was convinced the police could do that. Neighbor gave her a bad look. A person sitting at a bus stop. A snake was in their front yard. Someone cursed in public. Someone was tagged on Facebook in something they didn't like. Neighbor called their dog by a human name, which was bad because those people usually name their dogs weird names. Someone was standing at the end of their neighbor's driveway, then got picked up by a car. It was the neighbor's nephew. The ducks on the lake were too loud. Someone saw a raccoon, not injured or acting funny, just raccoon doing raccoon things, and so much more. Story 40. As a paramedic, I forgot my wallet at the hospital and need a drive back to pick it up. I threw up once. I feel better now, but still want to get checked out. I was diagnosed with strep yesterday and my throat still hurts. I rolled my ankle and it hurts a little to walk on it. I have the flu and have felt sick for 6 hours. I haven't taken anything for it and still feel bad. My doctor says my blood work is abnormal and said I need to see them tomorrow, but I don't want to wait. I was trying to steal something and the security guard pushed me. Story 41. Former paramedic here. We got called out to a residence for a foot injury. In general, unless it's something like running it over with the lawnmower or a drop knife, most foot injuries could be transported by car. When we arrived, there was a woman standing at the curb with her jacket on holding her purse. I asked her where the injured person was and she informed us that we were there for her. She'd been treated for an ingrown toenail 2 days previously and was told to return to get the wound checked and dressing changed. I explained that we were an advanced life support ambulance and that if I checked the box labeled ambulatory, her insurance wouldn't cover the bill, and I recommended getting a cab or a friend to take her. She signed the refusal and took a cab. Story 42. Firefighter friend years ago sent on a call where a family reported white powder on their table. I think he said they thought it was anthrax. Crew quickly located the source of the anthrax, opened box of powdered donuts. Story 43. When I was a bouncer, a guy called 911 because we were harassing him by kicking him out of the bar because he was falling down drunk, which I suppose was totally his right to do, but he got super mouthy with the cop. The cop honestly just wanted to put him in a cab and send him home. He tried repeatedly, but the guy got more and more belligerent. Eventually, he made a threatening move towards the cop. That was the first time I saw someone get hit with one of those expandable batons they carry. Hit him right on the spot between the neck and shoulder. The guy instantly acquired some extra gravity and fell like a ton of bricks. He got a ride then, but it wasn't a ride home. Story 44. My dad grew up in a small town. One year while back home visiting his mom, he forgot some laundry in her dryer and left for the airport. She called the police and they actually showed up to collect the laundry, then pulled my dad over on the highway and delivered it to him. Story 45. An uncle and his 2 daughters worked for Ma Bell for many years in a nearby town. One daughter was an operator. When was the last time you dialed 0? When 911 was first launched, people called it 911, unlike now when everyone says 911. An old lady called the operator and got my cousin and complained that she didn't have an 11 on her phone, so she had no way to call 911. My cousin, who's a bit of a smartass and had a very dry sense of humor, asked her to hold, waited a little bit, then came back to the call and told the old lady that they'd reprogrammed the system so she could reach 911 by dialing 911 instead. Problem solved. Story 46. Not a 911 operator, but I used to work at a liquor store, and we once had to call 911 for a customer. He was so drunk when he got to the store that he fell out of his lifted truck and bashed his face open on the curb. Another customer came in and said, "There's someone bleeding in the parking lot." So I went out with my manager to see what was going on, and he fell onto my manager while stumbling around and got blood all over her nice white shirt. Best of all, he said he wanted to just sleep it off in his truck. At 1 p.m. on a Wednesday in July in Atlanta, it's over 100 degrees outside. Story 47. I'm not a first responder, but I worked a major international festival with the emergency response team. A staff member calls the walkie on the channel that's reserved for emergencies. Him. "We got an emergency." Me. "I read you. What's going on?" Him. "The bathrooms are malfunctioning." Me. "How so?" Him. "The door won't open." Me. "Did you knock? Maybe someone is using it." Long pause. Him. "Sorry, disregard this call." Me. "I reiterate that this is an emergency channel. Never talk to me again unless it's an actual emergency." Story 48. Not a 911 operator, but a bar lounge worker. Had more than one person call 911 on us over losing money playing. Story 49. Leo not dispatcher, not. Couple of tasks this holiday period. Called to a domestic female reporting partner, woke her up and was being annoying. Neil violence. Just annoyance. Wanted police to tell him to stop being annoying. Adult male yelling at mother as he didn't get as many presents as he would have liked for Xmas. Driver reports 2 males walking along road with bottles. Nothing had happened, but they may throw the bottles. Story 50. Had an old guy call because there was a scorpion on his dresser. We have to create a call no matter what for an officer to respond to, and the officer that had that district called into us to say, "Really?" Officer called the guy and chewed his ass out for it and closed it out. Story 51. Elderly patients suffering from dementia, claiming they were tied up in an undisclosed location. First few times we traced them to nursing homes or hospitals. Reason for being tied up? They were being a tool or had a fall risk and kept wanting to go out. There was this guy who wanted to go out and smoke, but doctors denied it, and so he decided to harm himself, thinking it would make them give in and let him have a smoke. He got put in a psych ward instead. Story 52. I'm not a 911 operator, but in South Korea there was a famous case where a high-ranking politician, Kim Moon-so, called the emergency line and kept demanding the operator recognize his voice. Instead of reporting an actual emergency, he kept saying, "I am the governor," and got angry when the operator asked who he was and what the emergency was. He ended up getting the operators disciplined later, which sparked massive public outrage. It's still remembered as a legendary example of an entitled ego wasting emergency resources. Story 53. My craziest one was where a complainant was demanding police attendance at a priority because someone was stealing seashells from a beach. I will let that one sink in. The other type of call that frustrated me was stolen vehicles. After advising the complainant that they can go to their local police station to report the theft, they kick off and demand police to attend immediately to see where their car was parked. Mind you, it's a different story when it comes to a full moon. That's when all the crazies do really come out, but that is another whole thread. Story 54. Absolutely hysteric, frantic mother, called barely able to get a word out, just completely unglued and sobbing uncontrollably. She manages to get out that her daughter is missing. I asked, "Okay, when was she last seen?" "Dropped off at school." "Okay, does she come home on a bus?" "Yes." "When does that usually happen?" "Around 3:30. "Okay, madam, it appears to be 2:30. Do we think maybe school isn't out yet?" Silence. She laughed it off, but man, it wasn't even close to daylight savings or anything. I don't know what was going on with this lady. Story 55. I've had a woman call 911 because there was a beetle in her apartment and she wanted police to catch it and get it out of her place. Another time a guy called because he heard a noise outside his apartment door in the hallway and wanted police to come take a look to see if someone was trying to break in. He refused to come out of his bedroom to see if he could see any shadows under the door. He called back later to say it was the fridge making the noise. Story 56. A couple did not like their food and called 911 because the fast food place didn't want to give them a refund. Second one goes out to all the parents who give their babies or young kids their phone to play with. Kids often just try to press anything on the phone, which calls emergency services. Even if there's no SIM card in the phone or Wi-Fi, it will work. This happens over a dozen times every day. Story 57. Not a 911 operator, but a stupid kid who called 911 once because when I was 5, my mom went to talk to our neighbor and I thought she was gone too long. Boy, she was hot when she walked back into me on the phone with a nice operator lady who was confused but still comforting me. Story 58. I wasn't a 911 operator, but I worked in a hospital for 8 years and spent the majority of that time in the ER. By far the dumbest thing I ever witnessed someone be brought in by ambulance for was a lady in her early 20s who called 911 at 3 a.m. because her ingrown toenail was causing her discomfort. Story 59. Not a dispatcher, but read this in a police blotter. Bank teller calls 911 to report suspicious vehicles parked outside. Upon further investigation, it was people waiting for the bank to open. Story 60. Not 911, but when I was younger, my older brother dialed 911 and then said, "Hey, the phone is for you," then tossed it towards me. Only he didn't prepare for the fact that I wasn't listening and hit me directly in the nose, which hurt enough to make me cry. I picked up the receiver to hear the 911 operator and panicked and hung up. Police were dispatched, and we all got a stern talking to about abusing 911 services. Story 61. Not a dispatcher, but my best friend used to be one. The only story he ever told that I still remember was a guy who got his hand stuck in a jar. The dude just wouldn't let go of the pickles and couldn't pull his hand out, but over the course of the call figured it out on his own and then apologized with, "Sorry, I'm high as tits on a brownie right now." No services were dispatched. Story 62. 1. A man called because his wife had just run over his foot with the car. Why? She takes the phone. Because I told him to go and do BJ in the back seat and he wouldn't. 2. Frogs being too loud in the backyard. 3. Neighbor coughing too much. He had bronchitis, it turned out. Story 63. Years ago, an elderly lady in a seniors-only apartment building called 911 and dispatched me and my partner for coughing fits. When we got there, she was butt-ass naked sitting on a chair in her living room. There was no coughing or medical emergency. She just wanted to have 2 strapping young lads to come and see her naked and take her vitals. Story 64. Dumbest was an old lady who said a red light would be on the front of her TV every time she turned it off. A lot of mental health-related stuff is dumb, but they can't help it. The annoying thing is, people will call 911 for the dumb stuff, but call the non-emergency line and say they don't want to be a bother, but they think they're having a heart attack. Story 65. Person called because a wild turkey was in the next town. Not doing anything, just being a turkey. They called because the turkey belonged in my town and wanted someone to come pick it up and bring it back. Animal control officer said it's actually illegal to relocate animals in our state like this. This was years ago. I continue to question my life choices to be any type of public servant. Story 66. When my son was about 4, he was watching live TV, and the news came on while I was in the other room. The lead story was about a local house fire. Preschool did an excellent job of teaching how to call 911. Story 67. I'm not an emergency services operator, but I did once have a customer work at a cafe, call 999 and ask for the fire brigade because he flung a flip-flop into our pond when he was trying to kick the ducks. He then passed the phone to me and said I had to get her to come out to collect his flip-flop. Story 68. I called the non-emergency number because my whole neighbors were blasting music close to midnight. I lived 3 houses down from them and all my windows and doors were closed. Boom, boom, oompa, loompa, accordion sounds. Boom, twang, non-emergency acted like I was stupid and transferred me to 911. What's your emergency? Loud mariachi music. Story 69, 3 a.m. Guy calls 911 and tells me he wants an ambulance because his girlfriend had a rash for 3 days and he didn't like it. Obviously, this was before people were charged for ambulances. Story 70. The guy called after purchasing a new home on the outskirts of town. He had a deer crossing sign on the edge of his yard. He asked us how to get the sign moved after someone hit a deer in front of their home. The guy literally thought moving the sign would prevent the deer from cross there. Story 71. Not an operator, but while working in retail, guy called the cops because he wanted to work at our store and he refused to fill out an application. Cops were not amused. Story 72. I once dialed the equivalent of 911 during a somnambulism episode. I was dreaming about being burned alive. I don't remember much apart from waking up on the shower and my dad talking with the cops. It was awful. Story 73. Not a 911 operator, but the only time I've ever had to call 911 was because my washing machine caught on fire mid-cycle. You mean your dryer? No, the one that's currently full of water. Story 74. Back during the dial-up internet says. One of our Japanese guests' laptop modem was dialing 911. I was the front desk clerk and had to help him change his dial-up settings. Story 75. I once called 911 to report a man chasing a woman at night, yelling he was going to get her. I was scared to death. Shortly after, I realized it was a bunch of kids playing hide and seek. I immediately called back to report my error. Story 76. Embarrassed to admit, but in my naivety, having grown up on 70s and 80s TV, I called 911 because my kitten was stuck in the tree. My innocence was popped when the 911 operator said, "We don't do that anymore." I was 15. Story 77. She has a phobia of clowns and heard laughing outside her apartment and wanted officers to check the area for clowns. Her boyfriend was there and laughing at her. This got her even more upset. Like he can protect me if a clown breaks in here. There were no clowns. Story 78. Had a very entitled man ring up saying he couldn't figure out where to plug in the charger to his new electric car and say the car won't start. If that's not a genuine emergency, I don't know what is. Story 79. The other night, someone called 911, not the non-emergency line, because a dasher stole their drink. Unfortunately, the caller disregarded before I could dispatch it, saying, "The caller states Dasher, not Dancer, or Vixen stole their drink. Definitely missed opportunity for me." Story 80. We used to have a guy that would regularly call on a payphone and say that the sheriff's department took away his junk and would hang up. He never really asked for anything. He would just make that statement and hang up. What's the dumbest reason people called 911? Story 1. 911 dispatcher here. The dumbest reason is to ask about the weather, ask about internet outages, etc. You would not believe the number of people that call 911 just to have a conversation and tell you about what's going on in their lives. Story 2. When I worked at the airport, I had a flip phone that would occasionally call 911 for no reason. ERC, if you held one of the buttons down long enough, it'd do it. I'd usually notice it either because I'd hear the operator or because phones go into overdrive when you call 911 and it can get pretty hot. One winter night this happened and I couldn't hear it because I was standing next to a roaring jet engine. And I couldn't feel the heat because I was wearing cold weather gear. Apparently they traced the location of the call, noticed it was coming from the airport. And since it was just a few years after September 11th, it put everybody in the 911 office into September 11 emergency overdrive crap mode. A whole fleet of cop cars and fire trucks descended on our FBO office. It didn't take us long to figure out what happened. I got rid of that phone the next day, and to this day I go out of my way to make sure whatever phone I have doesn't automatically call 911 no matter how much I sit on it. Story 3. Advanced life support, EMS field provider for a municipality. Here's a list of dumb chief complaints. I have a yeast infection, and the clinic isn't open until morning. I think I might have a bug in my ear from last night, but I'm not sure. I've had this rash for a month and don't know what to do. My doctor called and said my labs were abnormal and to schedule a checkup. I have an appointment at the clinic at the hospital and the taxi that I scheduled didn't come. I have an appointment today at a faraway hospital. I didn't want to pay for the taxi there. Take me to the faraway hospital, please, for my appointment. My dad got discharged from alcohol rehab today, and he somehow came home drunk. She just broke up with her boyfriend and is hyperventilating. Your patient is the naked male on a bicycle. No, we don't know what's wrong with him. If anything, he's just naked riding a bike and someone called it in. He just waved at them, if that matters. My kid's finger is stuck in the top of the container of wet wipes. I used to get angry about it. Sometimes amused, but often angry. I was especially angry when, while we were transporting the yeast infection patient, there was a bad motor vehicle accident on the highway with entrapment, and we couldn't respond as the closest unit because we already had a patient using us as a taxi to the hospital. At some point, I got over it. I stopped making fun of it or getting angry for why they called. 911 is what it is. No one calls 911 no matter for the reason when they are having a good day. People call 911 on their subjective worst days. 911 is a backstop, a last chance for people on their worst days to hopefully get them course corrected and saved when they're worried and everything else is going wrong. 911 is the opposite of natural selection, stopping some of the weakest from dying. Operating a 911 system is an act of mercy and love by a society. Instead of getting angry or cynical, in my last year working as a first responder, I did fire, hazmat, tech rescue. I decided to give them a little grace. I realized it's a complete social and economic system failure when someone with a yeast infection doesn't know what to do and has to call 911 as the solution. Where was this woman's parents or family to teach her when she was younger? Where was her access to healthcare? Where was her access to a regular pharmacy? Why was the only fix to her problem to call 911? The woman who called because her cab didn't show for her appointment. I later realized it's because we have a crap system to get less mobile, disadvantaged patients to the appointments they legitimately medically need to keep them healthy. We need to remove barriers to care, not rely on ambulances to figure it out. When those patients don't see the doctor, they get sicker. As an MS provider, I'm then getting them as legitimate 911 patients that could die without intervention. When they call, I am using my skills by intubating for severe respiratory distress due to CHF and putting on pre-hospital, etc. But it didn't have to be that way. I got to use my skills, but we, as a healthcare system and a ducking country, should have done so much better by this person. That patient is probably costing the system and country 100x what it should have if she had just seen her doc originally and gotten her care monitored and adjusted. At the end, I realized, you call, I haul, that's all. Move on to the next one. While I could make light forever of the funny 911 calls, I hate talking about the traumatic ones, murdered infants. I've done CPR under a Christmas tree, SMH. Through odd circumstances of fate, despite hundreds of miles of distance, I had a fatal overdose of a woman I play with as a kid. Save what you can, accept what you can't. Hang it up at the end of the day. Story 4. My brother called when he was 5 to say hello to the police officers. No one at home knew he did it, and he couldn't explain why he called, so they sent a unit over. He was over the moon. My mom was livid. Story 5. I saw a video of a recorded call where some lady got in her car without her keys and locked the door. not knowing how cars work or bothering to check first. She calls 911 and cries that she's locked herself inside her car. To the operator's defense, they were very polite and patient, calmed the lady down, and after a few confused questions, asks her to try pulling on the handle. The sound of them dying a little on the inside was quickly drowned out by the embarrassment of the caller. As the door opens and you can hear in her voice how foolish she feels. I'll have to see if I can find a link to the video and add it here. It's worth a listen. Story 6. Among the reasons I've personally encountered: 1. To discipline their children. It's past their bedtime and they aren't behaving, but they don't want to get too angry at them, so they want the police to come and scare the kids into going to bed while the parents save face. 2. An old lady pressed her fall detection alarm device. The alarm center tries to contact her, fails, then calls for an ambulance. Paramedics get there and she's having tea with her friend and says, "I told you they'd show up." 3. As a taxi service in Canada. Yes, you read that right, and it technically isn't illegal, but there are some workarounds. In Ontario, you get charged for an ambulance only if you're transported and it's done by the hospital. I've seen many cases where the person lived near the hospital and was out drinking. They say they want to go to the hospital because they're too drunk, get a ride, then say the wait is too long. So they don't want to register, which means they can't be billed for the ride. Then they say they live around the corner and they feel better, so they're going to walk home. Cheaper than a taxi and cheaper than Uber. 4. To help them get any food item. It could be something like bringing the pizza/Uber Eats in from out front, or helping grab their TV remote, vodka bottle, buttering a bun, making coffee, etc. This is often people who are so morbidly obese that they cannot walk, or they're so drunk they want someone to do stuff for them. It occasionally is an extremely old person who shouldn't be home alone and is on a waiting list, but that's less often. 5. Because there is someone who looks like they need help but they don't feel like checking on them and couldn't live with themselves if they didn't call. The number of times someone calls saying they think someone is dead, but they don't want to check out of fear or laziness is insane. There are times where the same homeless person sleeping in a park gets 10 calls in a day, and not one person is willing to check on them. Complete waste of resources. Sometimes the person is awake and they just look sad sitting in a park, and someone calls because they feel the person needs mental health support. A guy accidentally swallowed some of his own semen, I don't know how, and was worried it caused his upset stomach. The call taker reassured him that people have been swallowing semen for generations. Story 7. When I was 14, I worked at an old-fashioned soda fountain sandwich shop pharmacy. One day, a lady came in for a malt and an egg salad sandwich. She was a 911 dispatcher. She was telling me about a lady who called every single day to ask what day it was, what time it was, and what the weather was. I told her to give the lady our number. Mary Mimi called us every single day, sometimes a couple times a day, asking those questions. The dispatcher asked that I call her if Meme ever skipped a day and we didn't hear from her. One day it hit me. I was 17, a whole shift without a call from Meme. I called the retired dispatcher. We all went to Meme's funeral. Her elderly sister showed me the note she had stuck to her wall by the phone. My name, Tate Substances Store, the number. Call every day. It's okay. Man, I lost my crap. Sorry, this question reminded me of that. I am 41 now. I still wonder about the regulars. Did she ever finish beauty school? Was that really Alan Jackson's baby? Did he ever lose enough weight to buy a Harley? Was the blind guy really blind? Or did he just like me reading his mail out loud? Did the pharmacist John Jordan know how poor my family was, and that's why he offered young me the job and had his wife buy me pants and shoes? It's weird what sticks in your mind and what doesn't. Story 8. I was out with a trio of guys that were all snow shoveling different homes. Towards the end, we started taking turns on who would go out to shovel so the other two could warm up and eat/drink something. On one particular house, the only black member of our trio goes out and does the shoveling. He gets done, starts on his way over, and cop cars show up as he reaches us in the truck. Turns out the house we had to park in front of, the occupants had called that someone suspicious was in the neighborhood. We get out of our vehicle, explain things to the cops. They realize what's going on and leave. With the job done, we left as well. It was ridiculous. Story 9, technically 110 because I'm not American, but at my last birthday, someone called the cops on us. Simply because a guest parked their e-scooter by my girlfriend's apartment building on the other side of a handrail, out of the way, and while the handrail was still fully usable. A few hours later, my girlfriend went out to the staircase for a moment when one of her neighbors, an old lady, found her and started complaining, screaming that the handrail was unusable and that she couldn't get into the house. I genuinely wonder if she even would have needed the handrail in the first place. Because when my GF escaped back in, understandably quite shook, that sorry old hag actively went up and down the stairs, ringing the doorbell like crazy and knocking on the door so hard that the cover of the doorbell actually broke off. She even called her family over to make more stress. Of course we didn't open the door. Instead, we took photos of the building's entrance through the window to prove, in case that, no, The scooter wasn't even close to being in the way. We heard them call the cops, but they never actually showed up. The police probably already noticed how stupid the situation was during their phone call. Or maybe they even just pretended to call the cops to scare us because they knew we could hear them. I don't know. That whole ordeal lasted for about an hour. That was almost 2 months ago. And from what I know, my Jeff didn't get targeted or something like that by that lady afterward, and nothing really came of it. Besides that, it wasn't my worst birthday. But seriously, we would have gotten the scooter somewhere else if they'd just asked nicely instead of going on a rant. Story 10. I used to work in an ER, non-medical, and saw this one go down firsthand. Get notified by nursing staff a rescue is being brought in for chest pain. My coworker is already prepared to get patient info from the truck crew, so I'm standing outside by the pedestrian door to watch them come in. Truck arrives a few minutes later and they back in for drop-off. The doors open and the patient walks out of the truck with rolling luggage. I'm standing there with a clear view of this thinking, this mother ducker does not have chest pain. As they're walking, I can hear them arguing with the truck crew. A couple minutes later, my coworker comes out of the ER, stating the guy doesn't want to be seen there. I was like, good. Immediately after that, the no longer patient then walks out of the ER and goes towards the waiting room. I'm now standing next to the security guard, watching the not patient pick up the phone on the wall and call a number. That's when I see the same truck crew that just dropped the not patient off, who hadn't even left yet, walk out of the ER, go straight to the waiting room, and start yelling at this person that 911 is not an Uber. This idiot thought that if they called 911 again, they would be taken from my hospital to another one. The idiot then storms out through the pedestrian door and walks away, rolling luggage in tow. I've seen some wild crap go down in that era, but that was hands down the dumbest thing I've seen. Story 11. As a police officer, we had a sovereign citizen we arrested for not presenting ID to us on a traffic stop, initiated because she had no plates on her car. She attempted to call 911 from the jail phone inside the cell to tell our dispatch she was being illegally detained because our laws don't apply to her. She did this several times in the same visit. I had another call from the jail cell phone because she was being illegally detained because the police officer didn't read me my Miranda rights when I was arrested. I arrested her for common assault. I never even questioned her once. I looked at the bar cameras provided to me by the staff and saw her punch the crap out of a bouncer. I know this won't reach the target audience. It's always the same types that pull this one. But real life isn't the movies. You should only be read your Miranda warning when you are detained and not free to leave a confrontation with the police and are being asked guilt-seeking questions. This also has a couple of exceptions. 1. Heat-of-the-moment sentences. If you shout information at me prior to reading your rights, I can use that information. 2. Public safety questions. If I have detained you as a suspect in a shooting or you have just ran from me and I saw you throw substances near a school, I can ask where the gun is or where the substances are for the safety of the public. Story 12. Not a person but my dog. She was being trained to dial 911 when she was a service dog in training still, and there happened to be a huge spider in my apartment. She dialed 911. The police actually showed up. I'm super confused because I didn't call 911. They confirmed call came from my phone. Then Puppy comes over frantic and shows them over to the emergency. That's when I remembered her training and explained to the cops about her learning to dial 911 at training. They get a good laugh and eliminate the threat and give the pup some head pats before heading out. Story 13. I want to say 8 or 9 or so, and at my grandparents' house, they had one of those Vetch cell phones. Anyway, I got bored and wanted to test the phone, so I dialed 911 but added a bunch of random numbers at the end because there was no way it would call 911, right? It did, and instead of explaining that it was a mistake or hell hanging up, I got scared and hid the phone underneath the couch while the guy was on the line. I promptly forgot about it, however, as my parents were driving me home. We did see police cars going the opposite direction. Later that day, I accidentally called 911 again. I got a hold of my aunt's iPhone and got the password wrong too many times that it prompted me to the emergency number and dialing anything calls the police. And my parents weren't too happy. They were even more pissed after my grandpa called and told them the police came to his house. Story 14. Not dumb, but more like cute. My sister, school therapist but also taught some classes, used to teach children how to dial 911 and what to say, and would explain to only call for emergencies. The kids went home that night and practiced. Not a lot of them. The next day, she had a visit from a very nice police officer at the school. She decided to let the local police and 911 call center know ahead of time when she was going to do that lesson next year. She still did that lesson for many years, but always gave them a heads up. Some of the dispatchers had a nice discussion with the kids. Story 15. A fellow IT guy I worked with once accidentally called 911 at work. I was in my cube when I suddenly heard Carl apologizing and thought I heard a police radio. I peeked around the corner. Sure enough, 2 of the town's finest were chatting with him. Our manager came out of his office laughing and shaking his head while everyone, including the cops, had a good laugh at Carl's expense. Turns out Carl had been working on a 911 report. We were a telecom company. and meant to call the person who wrote it. He zoned out and started dialing 911 instead of their extension. The moment he hit the second one, he realized what he'd done and hung up, thinking it didn't go through. But with 911, there's no delay. As soon as you dial, it's live. Confirmed by my mom, a retired dispatcher. The dispatcher treated it as a hang-up and sent officers to check it out. Carl got a friendly HR chat and the nickname Captain 911. Story 16. 1. A lady called to complain that a homeless person asking for money wasn't grateful enough that she gave him money. Wanted the police to talk to him about how to be thankful. 2. A man called to report that his neighbor was cutting down a tree that was in that neighbor's yard, but the person calling liked the tree and wanted the police to stop him from cutting the tree down on his own property. 3. A woman claimed that someone broke into her home and left her a new cat, which turned out to be a ball of yarn. 4. All the ridiculous complaints about people not wearing a mask. My favorite was a man complaining that a woman and her child weren't wearing a mask on a nature trail. He said that he had COVID, so they needed a mask because he didn't want to wear one. I asked why he was out in public with COVID to start with and not even wearing a mask. He hung up. Story 17. I was throwing a man out for getting belligerent. He was knocking crap off tables and screaming at employees. Walked up, started to put my gloves on, and told him he had until I had them on to start walking to the door, or I'd physically escort him out. It was mostly just a hand on his shoulder as we walked, just enough to keep him moving. He called 911 and told them I was abusing him. Wanted me arrested for sexual assault in public. Only time I've ever seen a 911 dispatcher hang up on someone. Story 18. The most annoying was when this guy called 911 because his toe hurt. And it wasn't gout pain, which I can sort of sympathize with. Nope, just hurt a bit. And he thought if he went by ambulance, he'd get right into the ER. I rolled his ass straight to the waiting room. Another stupid one was when this kid got caught getting off by his mom. He started to fake a seizure. I get it, your kid is shaking and saying, "I'm having a seizure." But if you know, people can't talk when they're having a seizure. Lastly, from what I remember being stupid reasons to call 911, this guy was tired of waiting in the waiting room since the emergency room is based on triage. So the more life-threatening problems get priority over the small stuff, and he decided to walk across the street to call 911. We had to pick him up, drive him back across the street, and the triage nurse sent him to, you guessed it, the waiting room. Story 19. There was a squirrel in the road, not dead, just playing. A car didn't want to run it over and didn't get close enough for the squirrel to move. They called 911 so the cops could get the squirrel into a tree. I lived in a small town with a hilarious police blotter of all the dumbest 911 calls made by the fancy people of the town. Another one was someone saw a real witch walking around. It was a girl dressed in black clothes and a cape. The caller was convinced this girl was a witch and coming to curse the town. There were so many other funny ones, but I forget now. Story 20. Years ago, I knew a guy who called 911 because he was out of beer and was too drunk to drive to the store and get more. He got a nice little visit from the popo over that one. Story 21. Technically, called the emergency line here in the UK once for a leaking pipe in the bathroom. The leak had gone onto the phone line. Yes, we still had one until about a month ago when they stopped doing them altogether. And it somehow called the emergency services. First we knew was when the police turned up at our place to check all was okay. By this time, the phone line had been disconnected. Still good to see they did turn up. Apologized profusely, let the police know all was okay, and they left it at that. Just glad that believed me, also good to know, they will turn up even when they are sure it's a line fault. That 1% could mean the difference between life and death for someone sometime. Story 22. I was like 8 years old and my family was moving into a new house. The moving truck ended up blocking the street at some point, and that was enough to make an old lady call the police on us. The issues are that the truck blocked the street for like 5 minutes. The lady didn't even say anything to us or the movers either. She wasn't even in a car. She was watching us from her living room. It was a narrow one-way street with sets of row houses, and each set had its own parking lot behind it with access on each sides. So anyone who wanted to go through could simply enter a lot through one end, drive behind a set of houses, and drive back onto the street on the other end to avoid the truck, meaning we weren't actually blocking anyone whatsoever. Story 23. Need cigarettes. I'm trapped in my car, not drunk, just did not realize they had locked the doors. House key is stuck in lock, drunk, not their house. Wind is causing tree branch to tap my window. Sober, old, annoyed. Wanted a page out to trim tree. Car stolen from hotel parking lot. Sober, stupid, flew into the town and took cab from airport to hotel. Need condoms. Multiple calls, some sober, some not so sober. Story chapter 4. Former dispatcher here. Took a call from a woman asking that the county move the deer crossing sign from by her property. I asked if the sign was damaged, if there was something wrong that she needed the sign moved, and she replied, "It's so dangerous driving here with all these deer crossing the street here. Can you just move it down a mile or so?" So they crossed down there. I politely responded that I'd make a note for the county, but highly doubted that they would move the sign. The sheer level of idiocy was shocking. Story 25. Had a small party in my backyard. No music, just 10 or so people hanging out. Cops showed up and asked why we were trying to hit the neighbor's dog. Huh? Apparently, one of our guests threw a single bone from a chicken wing into the neighbor's yard over a fence. Rude and uncalled for, yes. But the neighbor called and said we were trying to assassinate his dogs. I went over to apologize and grabbed the bone, but the neighbor just stared at me through the window. Okay? The cops knew them well and just asked to try to avoid interacting or planning assassination attempts. Story 26. I called the non-emergency line because my Amazon package was thrown into someone's gated property and I had just moved to town and didn't want a trespass charge for hopping over their gate. I couldn't stop laughing while trying to explain to the dispatcher why I was calling because it was so dumb. I apologized profusely to the cop who showed up and he was like, "No, yeah, it was probably a good idea," and hopped their fence to give it to me. I felt so bad. Nice guy though. Story 27. A person whom I told to stay off my property called the police on me when he came up to my home and knocked on my door. I answered and put a Smith & Wesson .40 caliber handgun to his head. Told him he had 30 seconds to get off my land. He left and called the police. The police came, showed them the video, and they arrested him for trespassing. Dude was mad that they did not arrest me. Story 28. My little brother called 911 when he was around 4 or so because I was picking on him. I had no idea. Neither did my parents until a while later. We were outside when a police car arrived. My brother saw it and guiltily ran around behind the house. The police officer told my parents that someone had called, and when the dispatcher answered, all they could hear was breathing before the call disconnected. They quickly realized who was the culprit. Once my parents coaxed my brother out from hiding, the officer nicely explained that 911 was for emergencies and to not call the number if there wasn't. We still like to tease him about it 25 years later. Story 29. I was dropping off a patient at the hospital, and as we're leaving, we get toned out to another call. Patient was pale, unresponsive, not breathing in a wheelchair outside. The call is a decent distance away too. Well, duck. So we hit the lights and haul ass. We get updates that the caller refuses to get any closer and see if the patient has a pulse. Fine, whatever. I get on scene as a fly car medic is rolling up behind me. My partner and I grab absolutely everything and go up to the patient. It was a duck and mannequin sitting in a wheelchair next to someone's house. Story 30. Used to listen to the scanner when you still could. It happened several times. Mom wanted a cop to come over and yell at, scare their kid. Once it was the daughter came home with a detention from school. Once the daughter was refusing to put on her bicycle helmet for a ride. Once the son was refusing to get in the water for his swimming lesson because the water was too cold. Then there was a guy that was eating fried chicken from the grocery store in the ATM lobby of a bank at about 10 at night, and someone called for the cops. Cops came over and reported no crime is being committed. Story 31. I used to answer police calls, and on my first ever call when I started training, this lady rang 999 to report that her 7-year-old son had been shaking pears off a pear tree, and the owner of the tree had come outside and forced the kid to eat all the pears that had come off. The only response I could come up, even my mentor didn't really know what to say, with was, "So how many pears did he actually eat?" She had the nerve to sound surprised that I had asked. The answer was 2 or 3 before she had intervened and called the police. Story 32. ICE agents called 911 last week to report that someone was trying to climb, open, ramming the entrance to their detention center. When local PD arrives, there were only 2 ABC reporters that were setting up a camera on the sidewalk. No one even touched the doors. Broadview police chief says ICE agents making false 911 calls. As for a regular Joe, I've heard recordings of people calling 911 to report a McDonald's employee told them the ice cream machine was broken and they really wanted an ice cream cone. Story 33. People calling 911 while in the hospital, they are universally disappointed with the results. Lady called 911 because she wanted to report a doctor who refused to give her IV pain medication. Elderly lady called because she wanted a Coke, and we were only offering her water. Older gentleman called saying we kidnapped him. Psych PT called saying we were blasting inaudible waves through him. Female in her 20s called requesting M's transport to a different ER because ours was busy. She came in via M's for a very obviously non-emergent complaint and was pissed when she was sent to the waiting room instead of an ER bed. Story 34. I've had people call for a stuffy nose. Not kidding, that was it. He walked down to the parking lot to meet us. I asked if he took any meds and he said no. He demanded to go to the hospital for it. Also had people call because they got little cuts on their hands equivalent to a paper cut. Chapped lips was another one we get decently often. Believe it or not, these take up a good portion of our calls. I'd say easily 90% of our calls as a firefighter, paramedic, are things that absolutely do not require emergency services, just the way it is. Story 35. My husband is an officer, and one of my favorites he told me about was a phone call from a perfectly able-bodied young adult who didn't want to wait for the city bus and was requesting a ride to her friend's house. Story 36. Personal fave of all time, was the cop who called 911 because he and his GF did some substances. He stole off a suspect and got too high, so they started freaking out that they were dying. Story 37. Once when I was maybe 6 or 8 years old, I went with my younger sister to her daycare during summer break to hang out. During their nap time, another girl who was slightly younger than me came over to me and said something along the lines of, "I'm going to call 911, or should I call 911?" I don't exactly remember how I reacted, but I vividly remember how she did it, and they picked up. We could hear the room noise from the other end, but no one responded. Finally, she hung up, and I don't think I ever talked to her again. Story 38. My nephew, 7, called to report that his house was on fire and his wife was inside. He's on the spectrum, and he was scripting. The 911 operator could hear my sister snoring loudly in the background and asked who was asleep, and he delightedly announces, "My mama." Sometimes I imagine what the operator must have been thinking hearing an obviously childish voice declare his wife was in a fire while my sister snored away oblivious. Obviously, they sent someone to check, but by that point I think he had woken my sister up and she told the operator the whole thing. Story 39. My friend had a bad high and was absolutely convinced substances were going to come and get her, so she was texting everyone stressing about it. I got there as she was on the phone with 999 and explained to dispatcher that she had a sober adult with her now. Her pulse, breathing, etc. were all normal, and I was going to make her eat some toast. Dispatcher gave me a few things to watch out for and said to call again if we needed to. Nice lady. Story 40. When I worked in a psych ward, patients would call 911 to report all sorts of false things. Sometimes it was just for entertainment, sometimes in hopes they'd be released. One day, a patient called multiple times. After the first call, they were banned from the phone for the day, but they got other patients to give them the phone. The police had to keep responding because the patient was reporting being held hostage, not being fed, and being abused. None of these things were true. I mean, they were on a 72-hour hold, but we certainly weren't harming them. Story 41. When I was around 6 in the 80s, we had recently learned in school about 911 and were given a sticker with the number to put on our phone. I was helping my mom with some yard work when the old rake she was using gave her a humongous splinter in her hand. When I saw it, I freaked out and ran into the house to call 911 because surely this was an emergency. She didn't realize what I was doing at first, so I did manage to call them before she caught up. They were good sports though. Story 42. I think when I was 5 or 6, I called 911 to ask for help with my homework because my mom had said it was the number to call when you need help. My mom was a few feet away and was mortified when she noticed she was cooking dinner. I was at the table. I remember them being in kind, and I think they actually were going to help. But my mom noticed I was on the phone, asked who I called, and rushed over to apologize to them when I said it was 911. Story 43. Lady wanted me to send the officers to look for her dog that she let out in her fenced-in yard because it was taking longer than usual and she had already taken her glasses off for the night. Man demanded we arrest the Schwann's truck driver for knocking on his door. Man was upset that his neighbor was flying the American flag upside down. Man needed help carrying a propane tank. But we actually found a meth lab during that call, so it wasn't totally dumb. Story 44. My mom worked in the call center for Yellowstone Park for about a year. She fielded a call for a stuck elevator. Turns out it was just slow. It reached the correct floor and opened while they were talking. A sick elk. It was lying on the ground, and its ears were twitching. A loose golden retriever chasing the bison. It was a baby bison following its mama. And one woman in a state of panic because there were no streetlights, and she had never seen true darkness before. Fun times. Story 45. My old roommates got too baked and called the fire department because they thought the out-of-battery beeping of the carbon monoxide detector was the "there's carbon monoxide present" beeping of an actual emergency. They came to our house, fire engine and all, smelled what was going on, promptly told them to get new batteries for the detector, and then left, homie firemen. The only reason I wasn't one of the idiots with them is because I had an exam the next day and was cramming at the library. Story 46. I lived with a billet family while I playing hockey in a different province. I made a joke that we needed a better breakfast one morning. We were out of cereal or something, and the mom dialed 911 and said, "Here, call child services on me." I was 18 at the time. I immediately hung up the phone and went, "What the heck?" And she laughed because she thought it was a good joke. The cops calling back and then showing up to give her a ticket for abusing emergency services was less funny. Story 47. I called 911 for a dumb reason. But I was like in elementary days, pre-elementary days. I don't remember how old I was exactly, but my mom has told me this story and I only vaguely remember it. But I was watching Titanic and apparently I thought it was happening in real time. So I called 911 and told them it was sinking. My mom caught me and apologized to the operator and I got in trouble. Story 48. I was on a flight a couple of years ago where the aircraft had to go around due to low visibility and snow. Nothing dramatic, a bit bumpy. Came back in and landed on the second attempt. An old lady a few rows ahead of me got her mobile phone out and called 112. local emergency number, to give them a heads up. The plane was about to crash. Flight attendants noticed the phone and were not amused. Story 49. In 4th grade, I was home alone because I was skipping the summer program just down the street that I was supposed to go to. So of course, I'm watching MTV and decided to clean my ears. The end of the Q-tip breaks off in my ear. My uncultured ass probably didn't even know what tweezers were back then, and I panicked and called 911. They showed up, pulled it out tweezers, and I got a massive punishment for skipping and being a doofus. Story 50. I'm a paramedic. I had an elderly woman call because someone drove by and their headlights woke her up and she couldn't go back to sleep. Also have had someone call for a toothache. They said we were taking too long, so they walked the block to the hospital. Mind you, we had to get out of bed, get dressed, and get in the ambulance. We have 2 minutes at night to get dressed and be en route. We're stationed 1.5 miles from the hospital. To any 911 call operators, what is the funniest 911 call you've ever had? Story 1. A guy calls from a payphone to complain that he has a pipe wrench stuck up inside of him and he needed an ambulance. He gave his location as the corner where the payphone was located. I asked him if he could tell me his appearance, so I could be sure the medics could find him. His response, "Look, dude, I'll be the only guy on the corner with a pipe wrench inside." I couldn't argue with that. Story 2. My mom was a 911 operator in the SF Bay area in the 80s and 90s. I asked her to tell me a story to pass along, so here it is. I got a 911 call, and I couldn't understand the caller. He was slurring his words. I knew he was calling from a bar, so I asked if he'd been drinking, and after asking, many times I was able to determine that he wanted the police, not an ambulance. He wanted to file assault charges because a woman pulled his tongue. I asked, "How was she able to pull your tongue?" And he said, "Because I stuck it out at her." I had to keep muting the call because I was laughing so hard. Apparently, my supervisor went on to play this call in seminars for years and always got a ton of laughter. Story 3. My department dispatches our area's animal control after hours. Once received a call from a guy freaking out because he caught a possum in his house. I asked him which room he was able to confine the animal, and he didn't tell me which room, but said he trapped it in a microwave. I had many questions. Story 4. My kid worked for animal control. We are eating dinner and 911 dispatch calls him. Some panicked lady had called 911 about an owl in a tree that couldn't fly. It had been sitting in the tree for a half hour, not moving. Of course, it was just before dusk, and the owl was just waiting for dark so it could go hunt for dinner. Then there was the call about the one-legged duck at the park. He actually went to the park to make sure the duck wasn't injured, but realized after 15 minutes how silly he looked chasing after this one-legged duck that was outrunning him. Story 5. I was the caller. My deck had a couple unsafe spots. Normally, I avoided them just fine, but on this night, it had snowed. I stepped outside for just a minute, because snow is very rare here. In doing so, I forgot about the unsafe spots. I stepped on one, and my leg dropped through. As I fell, the boards on either side of my leg bent, but then retracted. The hole was smaller than my knee now. I couldn't get out. My girlfriend got me a coat to sit on because my butt was already starting to get cold, and we called 911. Fortunately, I live so close to the fire department, they were there in less than 3 minutes. I lived so close, had I Wilhelm screamed as I fell. They'd have likely heard me and arrived even faster. But 4 super strong firemen couldn't pull me out either, and I will add to that I think the first half of this sentence would be fairly humorous out of context. Anyway, one of them went to get a chainsaw out of the fire truck, and while we waited, I started singing The Pit from Parks and Rec, and they all joined in with me, and we had a good laugh about my situation. Other than having a sore, purple leg for a few days, I was fine. I bought them all coffee a few days later. Super fun guys. 1010 would definitely be rescued by them again. Story 6. Not 911, but worked for animal control dispatch in a tourist town during my senior year in HS. Got a call from a lady that had called 911 previously and was told to call our number. Picked up the phone to what sounded like a whole car of very panicked people all yelling at once. After asking what was wrong several times, I finally heard someone yell, "A deer! There's a deer in somebody's yard. Y'all gotta come pick it up." Thinking it was a dead deer. Road hit, I said an animal control officer would come pick up the body soon. And a kid in the background starts bawling, saying the officer was gonna hit it. So I paused for a second and asked, "Is the deer alive? What is it doing?" Someone far away from the phone yelled, "It's just sitting there in the yard." So I said, "Yeah, this is Texas. He lives there. Just don't touch him or get too close, and y'all will be okay." Literally, not even 5 minutes later, we got a call from another tourist about a deer chasing a family after they tried to take a selfie with it. To this say, I'm still not sure if it was the same family, but wow, I hope it was. Story 7. Pre-911 before addresses were automatically shown. A couple having sex knocked the phone off the nightstand, and they had the police on speed dial. I thought she was being choked out, so I had the phone company track the address and sent the cavalry. When they pounded on the front door, I heard the woman say, "Oh my God, there are 5 cop cars outside." The guy went downstairs and she picked up the phone and said, "Hello?" I said, "Hello, ma'am, this is the police. Are you okay?" She said, "I'm fine, we were busy." I said I had been listening for the last few minutes, and she said, "Oh, we must have knocked the phone on the floor." The patrol guys told the guy they had to see her in person at the same time I was talking to her. She came downstairs so they could verify she was okay. They said she was pretty embarrassed. Story 8. I used to do overnight security and have had to call 911 several times. My favorite was a gentleman who was obviously on something, jittery, touching his face a lot, couldn't sit still. He tried to break into a house next to our campus, so I dialed 911 right then. As I'm giving them a description of what he is wearing, he starts stripping his clothes off, running across our campus. So I have to tell the 911 operator, yeah, he butt naked in the middle of the street, laying down. I think he's doing the worm. We lost the guy on cameras, no clue where he is. 5 cop cars show up and they round up the only guy in our area with no shoes or a shirt. We went outside to give the cops a statement, and the guy is trying to convince the police that he is the one who called them to report someone stealing his shoes. The cops don't buy it for a second, but they let him go, and he just runs off into the night. Barefoot, no shirt. Story 9. My late aunt once called 911 because my uncle wouldn't change the fan that was blowing on her. Because it was a small community in Michigan, the police laughed and came out and changed the fan. Story 10. Not an operator, but one time I went to a local library to do work as my home was filled with loud guests. I'm there for a couple hours and I saw I had 25 minutes left. So I packed all my stuff up and brought it to the bathroom so I could take a crap, not leave my stuff unattended and immediately just leave. Y'all, they locked me in. The librarians thought I left. The whole place was empty and dark. I walked right out the front door, which was locked, and triggered the alarm. Now, not to throw race into it, but I'm a big Latino man in a very white and upper class part of my state, so there was a real sense of fear I had. I didn't want to be caught driving away from the scene in case any Karens were peeping out their windows. I had to call the cops on myself and explain that I got locked in the library while taking a crap and the operator is dying. Cops show up and one of them goes, "So you like breaking in and taking craps, huh?" I went white as a ghost and started immediately bumbling my words. They brought the whole department out because they thought it was the funniest crap. Thankfully, they were cool and just laughed at my git. Story 11. At a long-term care facility, I worked at one of our residents called 911 with the phone in her room because she didn't get ketchup with her lunch. Kidding. The sheriff's office called back to let the nurses know what she'd done while I was standing right there. I've never laughed so hard at work. Story 12. Atlanta radio show in 1990 frequently played a 911 call they somehow got hold of. Guy had stopped to pick up what he thought was a dead road hit deer and put it in his station wagon. Deer woke up and goes berserk, kicking and biting him. Guy stops the car at a phone booth, calls 911 demanding an ambulance. And while he's trying to do this, some stray mutt starts trying to bite him. He thinks because he smells like a deer. So you get all the sound effects of barking dog, man hollering at it, then explaining the zany mishap that got him in this situation. I never did figure out what happened to the deer. Story 13. I worked the jail, not 911 or anything related to that, wholly distinct from the other agencies in the county. Some guy called about 2 a.m. flipping the duck out because his meth box smelled funny and wanted the fire department, but no cops. I got an address out of him after a ridiculous runaround and sent it over to the dispatch people across town. They didn't send cops. He was in the county. They sent deputies in the fire department and the deal and the hazmat team, and he got to come visit and then go spend an ungodly amount of time with the state doc. I think he got 50 plus years. The house property he was renting was demolished and is a hazardous area now because he was making so much meth and I think explosives. Story 14, 112 from Europe. Man, I can't count them all. A man called to say he's wrestling with deadly 10 mm, 32, 33 feet snake in his backyard. He was very scared. And although I wasn't sure how did a 10 mm snake appeared in his backyard, I send the emergency to the police. They even called him back, but his father answered. The conversation was quite funny. "Hello, sir. Police here. Is this Mr. Y?" His father. "Do you know where your son is?" "I don't know. Went to the backyard, I guess. Maybe you should check on him. He might be fighting for his life against a deadly snake." Turned out the guy was a little high and was wrestling with a bush. Dude wanted an ambulance because he needed to check if his girlfriend was pregnant or not. I heard her in the back saying, "But my period is over 2 months late." And he was like, No. A doctor needs to see it first." He didn't want to accept that it was not an emergency and couldn't understand how gynecologists usually aren't in an ambulance. Not sure if stories about people with mental illnesses should qualify, but there are some strong contenders like the Queen of Hamsters, that's how she introduced herself, whose internet connection apparently was cut off because she did not like one of our politicians. But she does now and she wants her internet back. A man wanted to prank his friend and hid in his kitchen behind sink. He couldn't get out and fire brigade was needed to free him. Story 15. My so is an EMT and has many hilarious stories. The one she loves to share is she was responding to a frequent flyer, they call a lot, who was basically given the choice to ride with them to the hospital or go to jail for the abuse of calling 9911 again This patient was wearing a robe. They brought him to the hospital, and he's drunk as always. When she does the call in for the hospital asks if the guy is wearing a blue robe. She says he is. You've never heard such displeasure in a person's voice when the hospital replied, "We will be happy to see you when you get here." So they get to the hospital and put the guy in a room. My So goes to check the guy in while her partner stays in the room with the guy. The nurse was upset and said, "Oh no, I've heard about this guy. I've worked here so long and never seen him." My So goes back into the room, and the guy's walking out of the bathroom, and his robe is wide open. She then learned he was not wearing any underwear. The nurse came in, saw the guy, threw her hands up in the air, and walked out without saying anything. Story 16, not an operator. But I had a friend in high school who got addicted. Years after she got out of rehab, she told me the story about how she ended up in rehab. She had called the police on herself because there are demons living in my walls and I'd like the police to come remove them. When she sobered up, she also realized she didn't live next to a pool. That's important because while she was high, she would sit outside and watch people swim. She did that for 2 years, even though there was no pool. Story 17, 112 operator here. I had a woman who wanted to report herself dead. She wanted to end her life. Do not do that. There is help, and if you have these thoughts, please talk to people or a doc about this. But she was sure that she died. A somewhat normal, middle-aged woman, and she called 112, medics, and fire 110 is for cops. So we would get her a morgue. It was my strangest call ever to tell a person, who was very much alive talking to me, that in fact she was not dead. We sent an ambulance for free. Long live the EU healthcare system. In the end, it turned out to be a shroom-induced psychosis. Yeah, weird, but also funny. Afterwards, story 18, okay, X911 dispatcher, I hear. So while on light duty due to injury working rescue calls, I was trained to do 911 call intakes in Florida and worked midnight shifts, always the craziest type of calls. I receive a call from a hysterical teenage boy. After getting him to calm down, he tells me that his friend has been swallowed up by a tube monster. So I asked him where this tube monster's at. Are you there with the tube monster right now? He says yes, he can hear his friend, but he is trapped. After finally being able to get the location of the caller, this is in the 90s, units are called to the scene, police, fire, and ambulance. Now, I have been on the phone for over 20 minutes with this young man and had him stay on the phone until help arrived. Then he says, "Man, my dad's going to hit me." I asked him why. He says, "'Cause I promised him I wouldn't drop substances anymore, and we've been tripping all night." So I had to get on the radio and advise crews coming in of the current mental status of both caller and victim. When crews arrived, they found the teen at the bottom of a hill, stuck inside of an actual plastic tube they had been climbing inside of, and rolling each other down said hill while tripping. The teen had to be extricated. The other teen was found by the payphone, awaiting dad's wrath. Story 19. I heard a 911 call. That was incredibly stupid. I'll share it with you. I was walking by an apartment in my building. The door was open, and I could hear screams of pain. I quickly approached the open door to see if I could help. The female on the phone, "Yes, I need an ambulance at blah blah blah." Silence on her end. "Well, he has a hammer stuck." Silence on her end. "You can come in and help him if you want, but I don't care if he pass." She threw her dirty kitchen towel at me before continuing to talk to the 911 operator. "Well, the some Karen put Mater juice in my Tupperware. Now come and get him before I smack him up some more." I got an old broken umbrella and I'm not afraid to use it. That was my mama's good Tupperware juice container. She gave it to me on her deathbed. She only had it 5 years before she passed on. He didn't have no right to put his Mater juice in it and stain it all up. That stuff is worth a fortune. No, not the Mater juice. The Tupperware. It's worth $1,000 if it's worth a penny. It has the original lid. I don't care what your mother told you would take out the stain. He done upped and ruined my legacy Tupperware. Silence from her as I try my best to figure out what to do. He was fully awake. She put her hand on her hip and said that she'd wait for the police to arrest him for messing up her Tupperware. Then proceeded to talk about her 50-year marriage to that man she'd just tried to hit. She was even joking with the operator. It took about 20 minutes for the ambulance and police to arrive. The whole time, the wife never once looked at her husband. She had no remorse whatsoever. I was the one trying to help. I was covered in his blood. The police distracted her while the EMTs got him out. Then they asked her to turn around. She still had one hand loose and grabbed her Tupperware to hit the officers with. I yelled out, "Not with the good Tupperware!" She seemed to come to her senses and put it down. Fast forward 12 weeks. He has returned to the apartment. The neighbors and I had cleaned up all the blood after the police said we could. Blood never used to bother me, but after all that mess, it sure bothers me now. Their daughter had come to stay in the apartment until he could once again take over living there. The wife returned to the apartment after 6 months in jail and psychiatric hospital time. He refused to press charges against her, so she was released. They carried on as if nothing had ever happened. I moved out of the building that year. I did see her obituary in the newspaper about 3 years later. It did include that the Tupperware was passed on to her loving grandchildren. What a thing to put in an obit. His obit came along about 2 years after hers. They were still listed as married in the obits. So I guess even if you're hit with a hammer and stain her mama's good legacy Tupperware, you can still stay married. Story 20. I used to be a 911 operator from 2014-2018. I was also responsible for training new hires on answering phones. One day, I get a medic call for a guy wanting an ambulance because he has hemorrhoids. I try to get more information from him, like his name, phone number, and where he's located. I get all of that, he starts screaming, "My a hole, my a hole." During his screams about his a hole, I turn to my trainee and blankly stare at her. That was about 6 years ago. We still joke about it to this day. Story 21. When I was a 911 call taker, I got a call from a gentleman reporting an issue with his toilet. For whatever reason, it was a bit hard for me to understand exactly what the problem was, except that it definitely involved his toilet. After a little while, I determined to the best of my ability that the toilet was overflowing and he didn't know what to do. Although plumbing issues are absolutely not an appropriate reason for calling 911, it wasn't unheard of. To a certain extent, I can understand the thought process, and people have certainly called 911 for less. After a bit more talking, however, I realized that he had not called about a plumbing issue. You see, it wasn't water that was coming out of his toilet, but demon. The demons were spilling out of his toilet, and he needed help. I put in a complaint for the police. I know cops for a mental health issue is not ideal, but it's the only thing we had, and kept him on the phone as he was fairly distressed. Unfortunately, it was a busy evening and the cops wouldn't be able to get to him for a few minutes. As such, I asked if he could close the toilet lid. He said he could, and he did. Did this stop the demons from coming out of his toilet? It did. This made him much calm, and I was able to release the call. Can't remember what ended up happening with him. I'd guess he was taken to the local ER that had a psychiatric crisis center voluntarily. But it stands out as the time I solved a caller's toilet demon problem with a very straightforward solution. Story 22. I had a call from a male who said he needed an ambulance because the beans are out of the pod. Not being entirely sure what he meant, I asked a few more questions. Seems he had an argument with his wife and things got physically violent. She grabbed his with her hand. He pushed her away. She did not let go. It ripped open. I dispatched the ambulance, as well as the police. Ambulance made me repeat the dispatch and then called by phone to confirm. Couldn't believe their ears. Story 23. Former here. I had a guy call in to try and rat out a Chinese massage parlor for giving out happy endings. It was clear that he had some kind of religious guilt about it or something with a deal gone wrong. Clearly not a case of abuse, so this is okay to laugh at, and was trying to make amends. While the premise alone is funny, he refused to say hi, etc. He kept beating around the bush about it and wouldn't give details, just heavy implication. Over the course of this 5-minute call, every other dispatcher picked up on the line and muted their mics, but the room was howling with laughter as this dude danced around getting a tuggy. Eventually, I passed it off his call to the Detective Vice Division, but that was a very funny 5 minutes of work-safe HJ humor. I had another call from a neighboring town that called us because the local department wouldn't take him seriously. His issue was that a coworker threatened to, and I quote, hit his junk. The second he said it, I started laughing because I wasn't expecting it. He said it with what felt like a comical tone to it as well. I recovered well enough and eventually told him there wasn't exactly a lot we could do, as it was out of our jurisdiction. But he kept repeating that he was going to have his junk hit, and I don't know. Something about that still makes me laugh to this day. Story 24. I was a medic in Salt Lake for several years. The funniest call I was ever dispatched to was to an AutoZone for a junk injury on the battery aisle. I made the dispatcher repeat the details like 3 more times because, well, I wanted to hear her say it 3 times. Story 25. I spent a few months as an EMS call receiver when I wasn't in the field. I had more than a few calls that had me shaking my head or in disbelief, but only one where I had to hand my headset to the guy next to me. Once I confirmed the address and that the caller was requesting an ambulance, I asked the most obvious question. Why do you need an ambulance? The caller, sounding like a young woman, spoke in such a hushed tone that I couldn't hear her. She mumbled, "There's coming out my stuff." What? She repeated herself. "I've got coming out my stuff. I'm sorry, I can't hear you." Apparently, this exchange took too long because a very angry male voice came out of the receiver. She got crap coming out her stuff. I was caught so off guard I just cracked. I handed my headset to the guy next to me. I couldn't even explain why. He finished the call, hung up, and just looked at me, shook his head, and went back to his own terminal. Story 26. I'm a 911 operator for the ambulance service. Was processing a call one time that required a Cantonese interpreter over the phone, as the caller did not speak English. Was told by the interpreter the caller was phoning for her husband who had abdominal pain and was constipated for over a week. The caller and the interpreter then go back and forth talking for some time before I interrupt. Me, "Sorry, interpreter, what is she saying?" Interpreter, I'm just making sure I've understood what she's asking correctly." Me, "What is she asking?" Interpreter, "She's asking if she can help it out, using a spoon." Me, "No, tell her not to do that." She later referred to where the pain was as his poo pipe, but at least that one made sense. Story 27, not a 911 operator myself, but I'll never forget the cop that called 911 because he thought he and his wife had died from an overdose. Story 28. I got a call from a sign language relay service, and these interpreters take their jobs very seriously. They convey emotion and never change the wording. So the operator identifies herself as a relay service and breaks into screaming, "My baby's not breathing. My baby is not breathing." I ask how old the baby is. Baby is 1 year old. I was working fire rescue this day and dispatched an ambulance, an engine, and the battalion commander. My coworker across the room started police that way. I returned to the caller and started giving infant CPR instructions. I instruct the caller to completely cover and seal the baby's mouth with their mouth. The interpreter then drops this bump. "What if I can't get around the whiskers?" "Ma'am, what species is your baby?" "Cat." Ugh. I then have to get back on the radio and tell everyone to scale it down. The battalion commander continues on to see if they could help, as did a police officer since 911 was dialed. The cat did not make it, unfortunately. While that is very sad because I love animals, I couldn't help but be baffled that this interpreter was watching the caller. She could see her. Why would she not tell me the baby was a cat? I get that they are not supposed to change the content, but this was a letter-verse, spirit of the law situation. It is very dangerous for emergency vehicles to drive code. I got a bunch of calls from the EMTs and cops throughout the shift, laughing their butts off. I haven't done the job in 3 years now, but that'll always be fresh in my mind as one of my favorite stories. Story 29. Colleague, let's call her Sharon, answered this one. Sharon was from West Africa and spoke excellent English with an accent that was a mix of a British and her native language. I was her supervisor and listened in on this call. Male caller. My wife is trying to hit me. Sharon. What did she do? Male caller. She put a mothball in my pipe. Sharon. A what? Male caller. A mothball. Sharon. A mothball. Male called. A mothball. Sharon. As an aside to me, what is a mothball? The what? A mothball. Exchange was repeated a few times. Though Sharon's English was excellent, mothball was one word she was unfamiliar with. And something about her accent as she kept repeating this just got to me. Listening in, I had a hard time stifling a laugh and couldn't compose myself enough to explain and get the dispatch out for a few moments. I explained mothballs to Sharon after the call ended. Ambulance sent due to possible lung damage from inhaling fumes from a burning mothball. Police sent for the pipe. Story 30. I had to make a 999 call once, UK, and felt like A afterwards. My daughter, who was 1 at the time, was crying in her cot, so went to check on her and somehow she had got her head stuck between the bars. I tried for a good 10 minutes to get her out to no avail. Had to call the fire brigade to come out. Must have sounded stupid. My baby's head stuck in her cot bars. Anyway, fire come out, lights and sirens, the whole 9 yards. 4 burly firemen come in and try to pry the bars. Nope. End up getting washing up liquid and lots of gentle tugging, and out pops the wee one's head F's. Also heard on a radio station a call recording of a fellow who called 999 about a strange object in the sky. After much chat, he finally realized it was the moon. Story 31, obligatory. Not a 911 operator, and I don't know if it's real, but there's this one I've heard a while back. 911, what's the emergency? I can hear gunshots. What kind of gunshots? Ratada, story 32. We occasionally have people call in, concerned that their local convenience store is locked and they can get in. Well, ma'am, that just means the clerk is using the restroom. They've been gone over 5 minutes. Some things take longer than others. We've had people wanting police and because those a-hole McDonald's employees refused to sell them a Whopper. My favorite, though, was the woman who was spelling out a name for us, using her own special brand of phonetics. Like dinosaur, like story 33. I'm not a 911 operator, but I got a funny 911 call story. My older cousin Steve lived with his parents at age 45. He's always been a strange one. Apparently he was constipated, and instead of behaving like a normal adult and taking some stool softener, he decided it was indeed an emergency and called 911. He begged my aunt and uncle to help them, but they didn't want anything to do with his 6'8", $380 ass problems. By the time the EMTs got there, Cousin Steve was naked, prying apart his butt cheeks, demanding that they get the crap out of his ass. The emergency medical techs explained to him that he should really just try some OTC meds versus paying for the cost of an ambulance and hospital trip. I wish I could have seen this go down. Or maybe not. In the end, he stayed home and eventually took a ginormous dump. Yep, that's my family. God bless the EMTs of the world. Story 34. I had one not too many months ago from a Spanish-speaking man. I answered. He immediately began speaking in Spanish. No big deal. I say, no habla uno momento, por favor, translator line, and get the language line on the phone and ask questions that they translate and give me his responses for. Nothing big. He just heard some shouting and odd noises. Suddenly, the language line drops, and I'm still on the phone with the guy. In broken high school Spanish, I tell him, 1 minute, I'm sorry, as I try to fumble my keypad to redial language line. He just responds in perfect, nearly accentless English. So, are the cops coming? My brain freezes, and I just manage to say, yes, sir, they've been dispatched. Call us back if anything changes. Okay, thanks. Click. I stared at my screens for a hot minute before breaking into distressed laughter. Story 35. Had a homeless guy call the non-emergency line once because his friend had gotten arrested and he needed the number to the jail so he could call him. I told him I could provide him the number to the jail and asked him if he had a pen ready. I heard some stuff getting looked through, and eventually after about 45 seconds, he goes, "I couldn't find a pen, but I found a rock." I was taken aback at this statement and asked him if he still wanted the number. So as I was giving him the number to the jail, he was scratching out the number to the jail somewhere in the city. If we have to just pick a 911 call, then once a lady called me because her kids were playing in a tree and there was a snake in the tree, so she needed an officer to remove the snake. I told her that snakes are allowed to be outside, so I wouldn't be sending an officer, and she goes, "So what if this snake falls down and bites one of my kids?" Story 36. When I was still in training, my supervisor would play back training 911 calls for me to listen to and dispatch. In one call, the caller says that their friend is dying and that they're in their car and they've pulled over on an access road near a busy restaurant. Dispatch asks all the questions, and eventually the caller says that their friend was hit by a car crossing the busy street in front of the restaurant. Dispatch keeps talking to her until a unit arrived on scene. They disconnect the call, and the next thing you hear is the unit keying up and trying to hold back the laughter as he reported that the victim had died of their injuries prior to his arrival, and that the victim was a squirrel. Story 37. Back in the mid-1970s, yes, I'm old, prior to 911, fire departments and police departments had to answer their own phone calls for emergencies. Every fire department and every police department had its own emergency number. I worked at a fire station where the emergency phone was broadcast on a speaker in the station. Some guy calls one day and the conversation goes something like this. "FD Fire Department, is this an emergency?" Guy: "Yeah, hey man, I'm over here by your old fire station and there's a cat laying in the gravel. I think he's injured." "Okay, do you know what happened to him? Was he hit by a car?" Guy: "Yeah, I don't know, man. He's bleeding and he isn't breathing, so good." FD: "Okay, we'll let the Humane Society know and they'll take care of it." Humane Society is animal control where I am. Guy: "Yeah, okay, thanks, man." Call ends, the phone rings a minute later. FD Fire Department, is this an emergency? Guy: Yeah, hey man, I just called about this injured cat." FD: "Yeah, we'll send the Humane Society." Guy: "No man, you don't understand. This cat's a dude." FD: "Like a person?" Guy: "Yeah man, he's a dude." FD: "All right, we'll be right there." Story 38. Man, did we have one chronic bullcrap reporter. It was rare if we didn't get a call from her, at least once a month. This woman would call and tell all sorts of stories, and to this day I decay if they're true, but I know she believes them. One, she would report that the Met heads that live in her woods are moving their product, and she can tell because they hoot like owls every time. They do this. There's no way this sound is actual owls, because actual owls only hoot during mating season, and she knows for sure it is not mating season. She refused to let anyone search the property to rouse the Met heads too. She swears someone trimmed the tails on every single one of her horses roughly 1 inch. She knows how long they were to start with and is positive someone trimmed every horse's tails exclusively. 3. Reports her neighbor shot at her moving vehicle while she passed his house because the bullet chipped her windshield. It was definitely a bullet and definitely the neighbor because he flipped her off once while he was checking the mail. Couldn't imagine why he didn't like her. These were the most noteworthy while I was there, but she was still going strong when I left. No telling what she's reported since. Story 39. I'm a receptionist at an assisted living. We see the police often due to hurt or dying residents, people falling being the most common incident. If a resident makes the call often, the police will call reception to give them heads up. Let the nurses know. Well, one night, someone from memory care called the police. The officer then called me and said, "Hey, someone from your memory care called. Now she isn't responding. Can you go check on her?" I go into her room and grab one of the nurse's aides on my way. We get to her room and ask if she needs help, why she called the police. She responded with, "Oh, I didn't call the police." I asked if she was sure. She said, "Why would I need to call the police? I'm just sitting here watching some TV." Once the aide and I were out of the room, we burst out laughing. I think we were both scared she was going to be seriously hurt, but instead this lady called the police and forgot why she called. And she was fine. We were just relieved. I went back to my phone and told the officer what happened. The officer said she had kept the line with the resident open and could hear us through the line. Story 40. I had to discard the funny to us, but too hard to explain why because of our dark and wildly inappropriate sense of humor, stories to find an appropriate one. But here it is. A man called and said he dislocated his shoulder. He sounded sort of funny and like he was caught in something, so I asked him if he had fallen or something. No. I was putting on a thermal shirt and my shoulder popped out, and now I'm stuck. I was going to drive myself to the hospital, but I'd have to drive with my arm out of the window. Ambulance was dispatched for a shirt extrication and transport.